How's everybody doing? Whoo! Man, what a great Sunday. My name is Brett, and I want to welcome you here this morning. If you are new to New Life Church, if I haven't met you yet, I would love to meet you. Love to hear your story, how God brought you here to this place at this time in this moment. Because this is a great day to be here. The sun is shining. Praise the Lord, huh? Oh, man, Minnesota needs it. I hear there's still a chance, though. Even though next week, 60 degrees, starting on Saturday for like the next couple days, 10 days, something like that. You know, I'm sick of every Sunday talking about the weather. I'm just going to stop. How does that sound? I'm not going to talk about it anymore. This is the last time. I'm done. No more weather conversation. We're talking about serious stuff at church, right? Serious. Man. Well, seriously, if I were to ask you today as we begin, what's the most generous gift you've ever given? What would you say? What does generosity mean to you? What does it mean to be generous? If I were to tell you what the most generous gift I've ever given is, it would be the $50 I gave my brother when I was younger. I shared that story with you before. It was actually only $45 of my money. I took 5 of his because I wanted 50. And my dad made me give all of it to him as punishment for the fact that I took his money, which to this day is still the most generous thing I've ever done. Why is it most generous thing I've ever done? Because it was all my money. I have not given away all my money ever again since that point in my life, except for one other time, and that's when I got married. Oh. Where's the drummer when you need him, huh? Ching. No, maybe that's not funny. I don't know. But have you ever given away all your money? You ever been generous enough to say, you know what, everything I have, I'm going to give away? There's a chance that you may have. In fact, as we sit here today, we are in the most generous country in the world. When you put a dollar amount to it, when we think about generosity, for many of us it's money because that's the easiest thing to give at times. And so when we think about a dollar amount, the statistics haven't come out for last year, but in 2017, it was the most generous year on record in the United States. As a collective whole, we gave to charity $410 billion. $410 billion, which averaged out then to every American adult was about $3,000 per every American adult. When you think about that number, 3,000, it may not be that large, but in comparison to every other nation out there, we were 3 times more than the next country in dollar amount per adult, and 7 times more than the third country to give away money. $410 billion. And what we saw statistically is that it came from the majority. It didn't come from the select few. It was everybody collectively giving money. Now, there were some generous individuals. In fact, one individual gave 1% of the $410 billion just themselves. The top 20 in our country gave 5% of that number, but 95% came from the rest of the United States. That's a lot of money. And there were some crazy generous individuals in that. In fact, we live in one of the most generous times in potentially the history of the world. In our modern era, there have been people that have given away a lot of stuff, a lot of money. On record, the most generous individual to have lived in our modern era is a gentleman by the name of Bill Gates. You may know him. He's the CEO of Microsoft. Bill Gates alone in his lifetime has given away $30 billion. $30 billion. On record as the most generous person to have lived in our time. Second place, Warren Buffett. You may recognize that name as well. He's given away something like $25 billion, which is incredible. And yet, in comparison to how much they're worth, is it actually generous? In fact, for both of them, that's only a third of what their net value is. A third. Man, I'd like just a little of that, right? My dad joked yesterday, he's like, I don't need to be the richest man in the world, but second place wouldn't be bad. But there's a gentleman that trumps all of them. His name is Charles Feeney. You've probably never heard that name. But Charles Feeney is known as the James Bond of charity, the James Bond of philanthropy, because he is dead serious about giving. His goal in life was to give away, and his goal still to this day, he's still alive, is to give away everything that he has ever made. And so as of right now, in comparison to dollar value, he hasn't given as much as the other two have. In fact, just a fraction of that. But in total, so far in his lifetime, he's given away $8 billion, which is still a hefty chunk of change. But when you look at how much he has given in comparison to his net worth today, the other two have given about a third of what they are valued at. He's given 420,000% of his net worth away to charity. 420,000%. As of today, he's only valued at $1.5 million. That's what his net worth is. Which when you think $1.5 million, you're like, oh, that still seems to be a good amount of money. But they tell you now on average that if you're going to retire with 20 years of retirement, you need $1 million. And so in the concept or in perspective of the world we live in today, he's average. If his house is paid off, if he has a 401k, he's exactly where the financial experts in our world today tell you should be, $1.5 million. And yet he's given away $8 billion, 420,000% of what his current net worth is. I've only given my money away, all of it, once. See how I did that? To my brother Grant, one time. I'm so convicted by that at times that I sit there going, man, I should be way more generous. When I look at how much I've given away, is it even a fraction of what God has given me today? Probably not. And when we think about generosity, when we think about how generous the world is that we live in today and the people that God has placed here, their generosity pales in comparison to God's generosity. And specifically, God's generosity with his grace. When we think about how God gives his grace exponentially more than anybody that has ever given anything away. In fact, he's more generous than anybody who's ever given all their money away, regardless of what it is. If Bill Gates gave all of his money today to charity, he would not be anywhere close to how generous God is, specifically in giving his grace. And that's what we're going to be talking about today as we jump into our passage. I'm going to ask you to open to Joshua chapter 24. We're going to be in Joshua 24. If you don't have a Bible, I'd love to give you one. There's a hard copy on the back table back there. You can download any on your smart device. But we're going to be in Joshua chapter 24, which is the last chapter in Joshua. We're coming to the end. We're going to spend a couple weeks in this chapter, but we've come to the very last chapter in Joshua. And this is a chapter that I'm going to challenge each and every one of us, put yourself into. Put yourself into this chapter. Hopefully you've gotten caught up in this story as we've gone. We've been in Joshua for a number of months now, and I have thoroughly enjoyed our time in this book. But here's a moment where I'm really going to encourage you, put yourself in this chapter. Why do I say that? Because this is Joshua's farewell. He's saying goodbye. In fact, as I talk about Joshua saying goodbye, I'm getting somewhat emotional thinking about the fact that we're going to be ending this series as we've followed this individual who's led this group of people to this point, and these are his last words. If you've had to say goodbye to somebody, you know this is a very special moment. A time where you just want to pull up a chair, you just want to sit there by their side, and you want to hear what they have to say. And so my hope is, in this passage, we're going to do that with Joshua. And so the next 3 weeks, we're going to break it into 3 parts. This morning, we're going to do the first part, which is going to be verse 1 through 13. So read with me, 24, verse 1 through 13. Then Joshua assembled all the tribes of Israel at Shechem. He summoned the elders, leaders, judges, and officials of Israel, and they presented themselves before God. Joshua said to all the people, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Long ago, your ancestors, including Terah, the father of Abraham and Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates River and worshipped other gods. But I took your father Abraham from the land beyond the Euphrates, and I led him throughout Canaan and gave him many descendants. I gave him Isaac, and to Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau. I assigned the hill country of Seir to Esau, but Jacob and his family went down to Egypt. Then I sent Moses and Aaron, and I afflicted the Egyptians by what I did there, and I brought you out. When I brought your people out of Egypt, you came to the sea, and the Egyptians pursued them with chariots and horsemen as far as the Red Sea. But they cried to the Lord for help, and he put darkness between you and the Egyptians. He brought the sea over them and covered them. You saw with your own eyes what I did to the Egyptians. Then you lived in the wilderness for a long time. I brought you to the land of the Amorites who lived east of the Jordan. They fought against you, but I gave them into your hands. I destroyed them from before you and took possession of their land. When Balak, son of Zippor, the king of Moab, prepared to fight against Israel, he sent for Balaam, son of Beor, to put a curse on you. But I would not listen to Balaam. So he blessed you again and again, and I delivered you out of his hand. Then you crossed the Jordan and came to Jericho. The citizens of Jericho fought against you, as did also the Amorites, Perizzites, Canaanites, Hittites, Girgashites, Hivites, and Jebusites. But I gave them into your hands. I sent the hornet ahead of you, which drove them out before you, also the 2 Amorite kings. You did not do it with your own sword and bow. So I gave you a land on which you did not toil, and cities you did not build, and you live in them and eat from vineyards and olive groves that you did not plant. So Joshua begins his speech by saying, the Lord says to you. And he speaks on behalf of God to the individuals, and he begins by reminding them where they came from. And he's doing this strategically in this place called Shechem. If you've been with us, you may remember this name. We've been here a couple times before. But one of the times that we were here was in chapter 8, when Joshua brought the Israelites to these 2 mountains. And he's sitting them between these 2 mountains, Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, and they're doing a covenant ceremony. If you were with us, they took these huge rocks, they put plaster on the rocks, they wrote the law in the rocks so that they would remember to make God central. To kind of give you a reminder via map, this is where we're at now. This is Joshua's farewell. Right there in the center, it says Shechem. Right next to it are Gerizim and Mount Ebal. And he's brought them here for a purpose because there was one other time that we were in this place. And that was in the very second message of this series. And we were there when we were talking about where the Israelites had come from, what was bringing them to the promised land. And we were in Shechem, or we were talking about Shechem, because this was a very strategic place due to this passage. In Genesis chapter 12, verse 1 through 7, it's the passage where God comes to Abram. We've read it before, but I want to read it again to remind us what happened there. Abram would become Abraham. The Lord said to him in this passage in Genesis 12, the Lord said to Abram, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they'd accumulated, and the people they'd acquired in Haran. And they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Morah at Shechem. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring, I will give you this land. Joshua brings this group here because it's strategically positioned where they'd been as they'd done this renewal ceremony. They believe there's an amphitheater there where you could hear him speak, so the whole nation has come here again to hear Joshua give his farewell. But even more so, this was a place that was known by the Israelites because this is where Abraham had been. In fact, not only had Abraham been in this place, but Abraham had been in this place with God himself. And so when the promise was made to Abraham that he would have this land and his descendants would come after them, or come after him, and they would be in this land, it was at this place. And so as Joshua is speaking here on behalf of the Lord, the whole congregation would know exactly what was going on. This would have been a powerful moment. As I challenge us to step into this moment, we probably can't because we don't understand the awe that would have been there, this wow nature of, can you believe what happened in this situation? We now have the land. We are here. The promise has been fulfilled, and this is where it started. Have you ever been in a place like that? A place where you've held something in high honor, and then you get to go there and you get to see the place where it all began, or you get to stand in the place where that person was that you held in high esteem. I had a couple situations in life where I had a chance to do this. Both of them are sports related because I'm a jock and I have no other experiences in life. First one was in California. I was in school at the time. I'm a freshman, and the guy living across the dorm from me was an intern with the San Francisco 49ers. He was there doing his graduate study, and he was in their training program. And here he was an intern with the trainers with the San Francisco 49ers. And one night we're hanging out, and we're just kind of talking about what he did. And he was by far the coolest person in the dorm because we're all freshmen, and he's like 24 years old. It's like, oh, you're awesome. And so he's sharing all these stories, and he's been in the locker room with this guy, and he's been in the locker room with that guy. And, guys are kind of talking. And one of the guys in the room says, I don't believe you. You've not done that. No, you're just making up the story. And he's like, I can prove it. And we're like, how? He's like, I'll take you there. Okay. He's also the coolest guy in the dorm because he's the only one that had a car. And so like 5 of us pile in this car, and he takes us to the San Francisco 49ers training facility. I believed him. I thought he'd been telling the truth. Guys were kind of ribbing him, giving him a hard time. And so we get there, and we pull into the driveway, and he's like, proved, we made it. He's like, no, you got to take us inside. I'm like, all right. So we go inside, and he starts talking to the security guard, and he knows the security guard. And the security guard thought what we were doing was kind of funny. So the security guard decided he would wow all of us, and he gave us a behind-the-scenes tour of the 49ers training facility. We had to go see where the trophies were. As we stood there, their Super Bowl trophies are right in front of us. We asked if we could touch them. He said no. But there are pictures and names of all of these great people that are there, and then all of a sudden the security guard goes, hey, come here for a sec. Pulls out a key, unlocks a door, opens the door, and there's their locker room. And we're standing on the edge of the locker room for the San Francisco 49ers, and he goes, go on in. Really? Yeah, go for it. So we walk in the locker room. Facilities is dark, right? It's late. He flips the light on, and here we are in this place that, for me, was one of the most sacred places. I wasn't a 49ers fan, Bears fan, right? I hated the 49ers, but they'd been good. They had won a lot of games. They had an amazing reputation. And as we're walking through the locker room, there's the name of Steve Young, Jerry Rice, Ken Norton Jr. So the late 90s, and these were guys that we'd watched win Super Bowls going, can you believe that I'm here? I was a freshman at the time. I played basketball in college, and so I'm dreaming as a young kid at that point going, just wait for the day when someone stands in front of my locker going, oh, it's Brett Lilly. That never happened. But I stood there going, can you believe we're here? The second time trumped that. A number of years later, graduated from college, moved to Illinois. I'm married at the time, and I reconnected with a guy that had been a teammate of mine when I was in college. And he'd gotten a job working for the front office of the Chicago Bulls. So we went back and forth, and he's like, hey, would you like to come to a game? And we're like, yeah, I'd love to go to a game. So go to a game, and we connect, and we meet up. And he's like, hey, would you like a little tour? I'm like, yep, would love a tour. And so he gives us a tour, and once again, get this special guided tour behind the scenes, and we're at the United Center at this point, and he takes us in the front office. He's like, here's my office, and here's the team meeting room, and here's the picture of Michael Jordan, and here's the rings, and here's the trophies. And one of the coolest things about that was in their front office was a part of the old court, the old floor that had been used in Chicago Stadium where the Bulls had won their first 3 championships. And one of the guys that worked in the front office, still does, a guy by the name of John Paxson, had been on that team, had made a number of shots that I can tell you exactly where I was sitting when those things happened. And here I was, he's the general manager at the time of the Bulls. His name's on the door, I'm standing on the floor, and I was a little kid all over again. Can you believe I'm standing here? Michael Jordan was on this floor. Scottie Pippen, Horace Grant, John Paxson. Like I could go through all the names of all the guys that had stood on that floor. Maybe he stretched here. Was there some of his sweat still there? I could oh man, they were on this thing right here. That's so cool. Maybe you've been in a situation like that. Because that's the awe moment that this group of individuals in this passage are in as they're standing there listening to Joshua. Maybe they didn't appreciate Joshua at the time. You and I have an appreciation for Joshua because we're many years removed from it as we sit here going, wow, They're listening to Joshua's last words. Do you understand what's going on right now? Do you understand where you're at? This is huge. They may not have known that, but they did know where they were. They did know that this was the place God had been. They did know that this was the place that Abraham had been. And they did know that where they were standing was where the promise began, whereas the promise had come to completion. And so Joshua brings them to this moment. And he says to them from the very beginning, remember where you've come from. And he brings up Abraham in this place where they're standing, where Abraham had been. He starts his speech, I think intentionally, with this conversation around Abraham and says, remember where your forefathers came from. Remember where they had been. Remember back beyond the river. Remember when they lived with the pagan gods. Remember when they were nothing. And God stepped in and said, I now will take you and make you something. He starts this speech, the greatest speech, probably one of the greatest speeches of all time. If you really read through it and see where he's going with it, he makes a challenge here that we'll get to in a couple weeks. But he begins by saying, remember where you had been. I stood in that locker room with the 49ers. I stood on that floor thinking about Michael Jordan because I remember when I had been a nothing. It was awesome because all of a sudden these guys had been something and I had been a nothing. And Joshua begins by saying, remember when you were nothing. When Abraham was nothing, when they were serving pagan gods back in that pagan land, when they talk about beyond the river, they would have known that place over there where you don't want to go. That's where Abraham came from. But not just Abraham, that's where we all came from. Which I love the dichotomy in this passage because what Joshua is saying here at the beginning of 24 is put up against the backdrop of 23. And so as you look at 23, if we go back to last week, if you weren't here, you can see the message online. But if we went back to last week, we see that Joshua is urging the people to remember their allegiance to God and don't stray away from God. So don't do all of these things because you'll be in trouble. Keep your relationship new. Keep it exciting. Go back to that place where you were fresh and new with God. What's cool in this is as he's telling us in 23 what we should not do, the very beginning of 24, he butts it up together and says, hey, you know those things that we're now challenging you not to do? Guess what? Abraham was all of that. Abraham was that exact thing. Abraham had been that person, and yet there's a beauty here because Joshua in no way, shape, or form is he ripping into Abraham. Is he making fun of Abraham? No, he's using him as the example to say, remember when Abraham was nothing? Remember when this nation was nothing? The Israelites had been created by God. They'd been chosen specifically by God. For why? Because God is a generous God. What did Abraham do to be chosen out of this place? Nothing. Joshua was reminding the people, Abraham was nothing. He then takes them to Egypt and says, God promised Abraham all of this stuff. He fulfilled it through his descendants. He takes them into Egypt, and then they were in captivity. So not only did they come from nothing, they were nothing. There was no title. There was no prestige. There was no anything they could align themselves with. They had not done anything. In fact, they'd been even worse off than Abraham had been. At least he lived in this land. He was prosperous. He had a lot of stuff. You read in Genesis 12 that he had so many things, and you get into Lot. They had to separate themselves because there was so much stuff. And yet they had been pagans at the time. Well, then they go into captivity, so they began as nothing, and then they had nothing. They were nothing, no title, no possessions, nothing. And to make matters even worse, they then come up against the Red Sea, and now they're helpless. And Joshua's laying all this before the people, and you're like, wow, this is kind of starting off pretty depressing. He's going after them. You were nothing. You came from nothing. You had nothing. And then butted up against the Red Sea, you were helpless. Oh, man. What a story. And yet with every great story, there's a twist. And right in the middle of Joshua, at the beginning of his speech, there's a twist. And the twist is, then you cried out to God. You cried out to God, and God stepped in. He stepped in first by helping them through the Red Sea. He stepped in by saving them from the Egyptians. And so they get across the Red Sea. The Egyptians have gone the way that they have gone. And now they're across the Red Sea. And he goes, not only did I bring you miraculously through the Red Sea, but then I fought for you in the land of the Amorites. And there were physical battles that God was actually in the middle of. And not only did he fight for them physically, but then he says, I fought for you spiritually. As he goes through the passage here, he's in the middle of his speech, he's talking about not only was there a physical battle, but there was a spiritual battle in the middle of this. And Balak wanted to destroy you. He wanted to curse you, and he used Balaam to do it. And Balaam tried as hard as he possibly could. But do you remember that in the middle of the spiritual battle, God made a donkey talk? God made a donkey talk, which was great. One of my kids came home from school this week, and they're like, did you know the Bible has a story of a talking donkey? It's like, yes, I do. In fact, I'm actually kind of referencing that this weekend. That's so cool. A donkey talked. You have no idea what I'm talking about. Numbers 22. Numbers chapter 22. The Bible is the coolest book ever written. There's a talking donkey. And yet, as again, he's telling the story, they would have stood in awe going, remember when the donkey talked? Remember when God saved them from the Egyptians, saved the Israelites from the Egyptians, fought physical battles, fought spiritual battles, and now he's brought them to this point where he's done all of this stuff for them. For what reason? There is no reason. There's zero reason. In fact, as scholars have debated over and over and over and over and over again, what is so amazing about God's grace? It comes back to this. He gives it for no reason at all. Beyond comprehension at times, where we want to read this story and go, come on, there had to have been something. In fact, there's a book called Jubilee, a book that was written many years ago that tells the story of Abraham a little bit differently. And in that story, it's presented in a way that, you know what, when Abraham was back across the river, he actually was way better than everybody else around him. He didn't worship the pagan gods. He didn't live a lifestyle that everybody else lived. He wasn't that person. And so because of that, then he was chosen. Well, the Bible doesn't back that up at all. In fact, as you read through the story of Abraham and the descendants of Abraham and Laban and some of these other individuals that are connected to Abraham, what you see is it's exactly what Joshua said. They were worshiping other gods. They were across in this pagan land doing pagan things. No reason whatsoever that God gave his grace other than he's a generous God. But not only does he save them out of his generosity, out of his grace, from all this stuff going on, he then blesses them. Verse 13, so I gave you a land on which you did not toil, and cities you did not build, and you live in them and eat from vineyards and olive groves that you did not plant, which is exactly what he promised he would do. Deuteronomy 6, 10 through 12. And the Lord your God brings you into the land he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give you, a land with large, flourishing cities you did not build, houses filled with all kinds of things you did not provide, wells you did not dig, and vineyards and olive groves you did not plant. Then when you eat and are satisfied, be careful that you do not forget the Lord, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Joshua's referencing a passage they would have known. Deuteronomy chapter 6, we read it a number of weeks ago, 6 through 8. It's probably part of what they wrote on the stones when they were in this place last time. And Joshua says, remember the promise that God gave you that at some point you would be in this land, that you would be here, you would be in this place, cities you did not build, land that you did not toil over, vineyards and olive groves that you did not plant, and you would be eating all of it. Why? Because of my grace. But here's the warning, do not forget me when you get there. Why would I forget you? You gave me all of this. And yet exactly what we talked about last week, it's so easy when you've been given it, when it's no longer new, that slowly it starts to fade. And yet in this passage, Joshua yet again says, remember where you've come from. Remember what God has done. Remember what he has given you. What's captivating for me about this passage is that as you read Scripture, as you go through the Bible, as I've said it many times before, we are a continuation of this story. And so as we read this passage, it's fascinating because not only is it the story of the Israelites, it's the story of us. It's our story. Joshua is compelling to me because Joshua is speaking directly to me. This passage is easy for me to get caught up in because he's speaking to when I was just like Abraham. As we put ourselves into this story, Joshua's looking at each one of us going, remember when? Remember when you were nothing? Remember when you had nothing? Remember when you were helpless? Remember when you cried out to God and all of a sudden your life radically changed and he stepped in, not because of anything that you have done, but because everything that he had done. Abraham was a nobody. The Israelites were nobodies. They had no right to anything they'd been given except for the fact that God is generous. Which then you put yourself in that situation, and I look at my life going, God, why have you given me this? I love my life. I love New Life Church. I love being in Minnesota. I love all of it. I'm an overly happy person at times. I'm very optimistic, so life is great most of the time. And yet I catch myself repeatedly going, God, what is it that I have done? Why have you put us here? Why do we live in the country that we live in? Why do we have access to what we have access to? And the answer is, I don't know. I can't tell you why God has done that, other than the fact that he is generous. And that my story is their story. And the gracious God that gave the land to the Israelites is the same God that through that land gave us Jesus. And so why am I blessed today? Because of what God did through his son, through the land that he'd given, because he's a gracious, generous, loving God. See, there's a plan in all of this. God had a plan from the very beginning, and that plan led to salvation because that's where God's generous grace always goes. It always leads to salvation. The land given to the Israelites was a plan back in Genesis 12 to bless the world because through his generosity to Israel, he would bless all nations through this man named Jesus because out of this land would come this nation, and this nation would grow and it would continue to expand, and out of this line would come this man who would save the whole world. Because God is generous and gracious and says, I want to spend eternity with you. I want to give you the best blessings I possibly can. I want to give you everything. Why? Not because of what you have done, but because of what I have done, because I love you. And I know that you can't find your way out. Just like the Israelites. They were helpless. They're up against the Red Sea. And God steps in and says, I love you so much, I'll give you a way out. That was us. We were captives. We were in prison. And God said, I will step in and make you free. Not because what you have done, but because what I will do through this man named Jesus, who went to the cross and said, because of my love for you, my generous grace, I will die for you. And I will give you freedom, and I will give you abundance, and I will give you my grace, not because of anything that you have done. What? And when we reflect on that, when we put ourselves in the story, when we meditate on it, we can only be blown away because of the generosity of God. And he comes to every single one of us and says, I want to give that to you. Because see, God is generous in giving his grace. More generous than anyone that has ever given anything in the whole world. And he's given his grace to us. What if Bill Gates came to you and said, I'd love to give you $1 billion. This person that I know heard about your situation, whatever you're in, whatever you're going through. And he said, to help in this situation, to help you where you're at, I've been referred by this friend to you, and now I want to give you $1 billion. How many people would take it? How many people would take it? Well, you'd be stupid if you did. Why do I say that? Because statistics show us that when people come into an unexpectedly large amount of money, you know what happens? It ruins them. It ruins them. They go bankrupt. They lose all their friends. They slip into alcoholism. I mean, the statistics are astounding. If Bill Gates comes to you tomorrow and says, I'll give you $1 billion, run. Run. Run away. In fact, as we look at statistics of that, we should never play the lottery. Don't play the lottery. Your life will be ruined. There's reality shows that tell us this, and yet we go, oh, it's one of the biggest jackpots ever. And then I read an article the other day about how much money you'd actually take home if you won this big jackpot. Guess what? It's only like 33%. So $200 million, not that big of a deal. And yet we'd sit there going, yeah, Bill, I'll take your money. And yet God, who's more generous than Bill Gates ever will imagine being, has come to us and said, I'm giving you something so much better. I'm giving you eternity. I'm giving you freedom in this world. I will give you salvation, not because of anything you have done, but because what I have done for you, here it is. And you know what many of us say? I'm good. I'd rather have Bill Gates' money than God's grace. Maybe you're one of those individuals today. Maybe you're sitting here today having never accepted God's grace. And maybe you've said, I'm not good enough yet, or I'm not there yet, or I haven't gotten to a place where I feel comfortable enough to be vulnerable to say, God, I need it. Well, guess what? You'll never be there, and nor do you need to be. Maybe you're at a place just like the Israelites, with your back up against the Red Sea. You've realized you have nothing. You've realized where you've come from. You realize there's no hope. Well, the beauty of the gospel is cry out and he will listen. And he will step into your situation. And he will lift you out of it. And he will give you something way better than $1 billion. So maybe today's that day. Or maybe today's the day where we understand that we've been given that grace. And the Bible tells us that once we received it, what's our responsibility? Give it away. Don't hold on to it. Don't keep it to yourself. Share it with the whole world, because there's a lot of people out there that want $1 billion, and we've got the answer. Say, don't do it. Don't. I got something way better for you. Because what you experience is, and what you find is that as you give God's grace, more often than not, you receive it way more than you give it. I had a chance this week to read a number of stories of individuals that have been impacted by working with organizations like Together for Good. Next week, if you come to the vision meeting, you're going to hear about a couple things that we're doing, and one of them is this. Together for Good is an organization that comes around families to support them in times of need, to care for kids on a temporary basis and sometimes a permanent basis, but to really show God's grace to this world. I was reading stories of individuals whose lives had been changed by organizations like Together for Good. There was one that jumped out at me. It was of this couple that had decided to take in this individual, take in this 8-year-old girl. They welcomed her into their home, and it had been a very tough situation that she'd come from. She'd been in another setting, and because of what had happened in that setting, she'd been removed because of some behavior issues, and so they knew when they took her into their house that it was going to be tough. And yet their desire was to show this 8-year-old little girl God's love. Because from what they could tell, she'd never experienced it before. And so they bring her into their home, and just as they expected, it was really hard. They thought for a little bit it'd be temporary to try to help her heal or help her move on to the next spot. But as they got to know this little girl, they started realizing that God was moving in their heart and that this wasn't going to be something temporary, this would be something permanent. And so they started filing the paperwork to make it permanent, to adopt this little one into their home. And as they got to know her more, they started realizing why some of the things were tough in her last situation. And one of them was that through the behavior issues, punishment that this previous couple had used was she could not go on vacation with them because she had not behaved appropriately. And so they took everybody on vacation, all their biological kids and other individuals that were in the home, but they left her behind over and over and over again. And she started learning that because of her behavior issues, she was not wanted in that family. So instead of trying to change her behavior, she started acting out more. And because of that, then, she ended up being removed from the home. But one of the places that this family would go to over and over and over on vacation was Disney. And so this little girl grew to want to go to Disney because she had been told her whole life that she was not good enough to go to Disney. And so as this new couple hears this story, they commit then to taking their whole family to Disney. They were going to make this a family trip so that she would feel like she belonged. And so they tell the family well ahead of time that they were going to go, try to get everybody excited. And what she did, instead of getting excited, she started acting out, testing the boundaries, trying to figure out whether they'd really take her, if they really loved her enough to make her a part of the family. And so after a number of incidents, father sits down this little girl and says, I just don't know what's going on, but your behavior needs to change. And defiantly, she looks at him and says, and if I don't, will you not let me go to Disney? And in that moment, like every human being, he sat there going, that's the answer. I'll use that, right? Oh, if I tell her that if she doesn't change her behavior, she can't go to Disney, maybe that will change her behavior. But God stepped into that situation and gave him the grace to say, no, we're going to go to Disney as a family, and you're part of our family. We're going together, but there will be consequences for your behavior. You need to change your behavior. Well, instead of it getting better, it got worse. And she kept acting out, acting out, acting out. And the week before Disney was the worst of the behavior. All the way leading up to walking into the gates, she did everything she possibly could to make their life miserable, or at least that's what it seemed. And then they entered the park. And everything changed. Her demeanor changed, her behavior changed, everything changed. And they had a pretty fun day. He said, we spent a ton of money. We stood in long lines. But had just enough magic to make you contemplate maybe coming back. Which I totally understand. And he gets to the end of the day, and this devil child turned angel is in the hotel room as they're getting ready to go to bed, and he pulls her onto his lap, and he says, how was your day? With tears in her eyes, she looked at him and for the first time called him Daddy. She said, Daddy, you took me to Disney. Not because I was good, but because I'm yours. And that's grace. And that's what God extends to each and every one of us. See, Disney is nowhere near as awesome as eternity. And yet God looks at each one of us and says, I want to take you to a place better than Disney. I want to take you to eternity with me, not because you're good, not because you deserve it, because when you cry out to me, you're mine. And there's no stipulations. There's nothing standing in the way of every single one of us crying out, God, make me yours. And when we do, he says yes. And that's grace. As Joshua says his farewell, he says, remember what God has done for you. Remember the grace that he has given you, the generous God that took us from nowhere, that brought us to this point, that has given us this land that we cannot forget. The same challenge to us too, that we can't forget. There's a God that took us from nothing, that brought us to this point, that when we cried out, he answered. And if you've accepted that grace, our responsibility is to give it away. Because through Jesus, there is hope. That we can be like Abraham. That we can be living in a land of the pagans with all these other gods, and that we can be changed and we can be brought to this point where God says, come with me. Not because of anything that you've done, but because you're mine. I'm so thankful for what Christ did on the cross. And that we have that hope. So that hope is open to anybody. So let's not let it stay in this room. Let's not let it sit here, because we have the message that can change the world. So as we leave this place, let's make sure we share it. I'd love to hear your story. I'd love to see how God changes your life and my life and our lives together as we give his grace, as he's given his grace to us, and we see him change the world. Pray with me. Lord, we thank you. We thank you so much this morning for your grace. That you are a generous God that gives so abundantly, not because of anything that we have done. Not because of who we are or where we came from or the status that we had or the money that we've given or the good deeds that we've done. Lord, none of that matters. And you share that over and over and over and over and over again with us, Lord, and yet we need to be reminded over and over and over and over again as we seek after those things that don't really matter. Yet because, God, you have sent your son Jesus through what you've done on the cross, we have hope, and through you, Lord, that when we cry out, you answer. And you open the door and challenge us to give it all away. So I pray, Lord, that we are a gracious people. And as we have received your grace, that we give away your grace. So the world will see that Jesus, through you, there is a chance to no longer live across the river, but to be a part of your people and your community, together with you for eternity. We thank you, we praise you, we give it all to you in Jesus' name. Amen.